Committee. Eddie and JG are handing out some material. Thank you very much. And while we're doing that, we'll start with a point of personal privilege. Senator Kirshen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, I'm fortunate to have some outstanding people here at the Capitol, and they are from Cheney, Wichita, and Mulvane. When I say your name, you can stand up. Raylan Heckathorn, Maddox Har, did I spell that right? Addie Kleinsmith, and Lila Johnston. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the tax. Welcome to the Tax Committee. Committee, I do have a bill request. It's on doing some research. We found out that there is somewhat of a conflict on 1031 on forms that people fill out for those sales. So I'm requesting a bill to make a change to the sales tax, property tax, I'm sorry, statute excluding the sale of 1031 information. So are there any questions? Any objection? Seeing none, we'll make the request. Let's go ahead and get started with the presentation, and then committee, we are going to work a couple of bills, so hopefully we can get through those. Thank you, JG. And thank you for all your work on this, you and Eddie both. I know you guys put a lot of time. People don't realize how much, so thank you.
Committee Chairman, thank you. What you have in front of you is one of the chairman's favorite graphs, and it reflects receipts and expenditures and how those interact over time. So when you look at the chart, on the left is dollars, and those are in millions. And then for the fiscal year on the bottom, and it includes FY23 governor's budget recommendations and 24 governor's budget recommendations. The green line reflects receipts, and the red line reflects expenditures. When the green line is above the red line, when receipts are above expenditures, we're building up an ending balance. So when you look at 2007, you'll see that between 2003 and 2007, there was a balance that was being created, an ending balance. And then in 2008, 9, and 10, our expenditures were above receipts, so we were spending down that ending balance. And then it started again in 2010. 2010, where those meet, that means that we had the budget and the expenditure, or the revenue and expenditures match up exactly, which usually means there was some type of a problem, like we ran out of ending balances. 2011, we started those increases again in revenue and expenditures and spent them down again in 2014 until we got to 2016 and 2017, where they were equal. Balances again. It created in 18, 19, and 20, spent those down. Big increase in expenditures, met those, and now we're projecting once again for the governor's budget that receipts are above expenditures for 23 and 24.
Committee, any questions? And JG is correct. I ask for this graph every year. I think it's a good visual of what we're doing and a reality check.
And it really is.
Yeah. So thank you. Would you mind if we break real quick? We've got a couple of items we need to take care of, and then we'll return back to these. Okay, for bill introduction, Senator Holland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 23 RS 1214, an act concerning income taxation related to Kansas adjusted gross income, providing an additional modification for losses for any investment in a TEFI.
Are there any questions? Any objections? We'll make the request.
Thank you.
Thank you. Committee, I'm going to turn your attention to Senate Bill 55. Amelia, will you give us a brief overview?
Senate Bill number 55 was one of the annual back-to-school sales tax holiday bills that you heard. It would provide an annual back-to-school sales tax holiday for certain school supplies, computers, and clothing, beginning with tax year 2023. It provides definitions of those items, as well as some sale price limitations.
Thank you, Amelia. Committee, any questions? Seeing none, what are your wishes on the bill? Senator Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we strip the contents out of Senate Bill 55 and add in the contents of Senate Bill 138.
Thank you. And I will ask Amelia to give us a brief overview on Senate Bill 138, so everybody's aware of the motion. But is that a motion, Senator? Thank you. Is there a second on the motion? I'll second the motion then. Senator, it's been moved and seconded. Moved by Senator Peterson, seconded by Senator Tyson. And Amelia, would you mind giving us an overview on the contents of 138?
Senate Bill number 138 related to property tax exemptions, and it expanded and clarified the exemption for Strother Field Airport property. It added the additional language of including political subdivisions comprising the Strother Field Airport, and clarifying that the property, whether it was used for several different purposes, would be exempt from taxation.
Committee, any questions? Senator Reddy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have the bill that she just discussed in my folder. I don't know if I have.
That's because we passed it out earlier. This committee's already passed it out.
Right. I know.
So,
Okay, they passed it out to the floor.
yeah, it's in your folder in your office. If you want to wait, we can,
Oh, I think I'm familiar with the bill, but I'm open to, I have a few questions, but I'll wait.
it's time for discussions. It's been moved and seconded.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like I said, I think the one with the airport that's just now come up, but the addition of what Senator Peterson is adding to it, my recollection from what I read in the past was also the Education Building Fund and the State Building Fund was
So
also.
I would like to clarify, Senator, before we go on. It's none of that. We are just adding the original contents of Senate Bill 138.
Okay, so we're not going to discuss the
It's
other.
just the airport.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Okay. Committee, any other questions, clarification? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Nay. Would you like to be recorded? Seeing none, the motion carries. Committee, what are your wishes on the bill? And just for clarification, we'll make it a Senate substitute bill. Senator Peterson.
I move that we pass Senate Bill 55 out as amended and make it a substitute bill be created and be moved favorable for passage.
It's been moved by Senator Peterson, seconded by Senator Tyson. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, all those in favor, say aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you, committee. We do have a couple other bills I want to work. Let's turn our attention back to the presentation, and we will turn our attention to those bills after, and I will give you the bill numbers. 127, 147, 164, 29, depending on how time permits. So would you mind? Thank you. Although I don't want you to be distracted during this presentation. It's very important.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. In addition to the line graph that JG earlier provided and passed out, you should have 3 further documents from our office. The first of those is a table of bills that have been passed by the Senate so far, and the other 2 are 2 different state general fund profiles. JG will be up to go over those 2 state general fund profiles momentarily, but I'm actually just going to go over quickly the list of bills that are provided. I think the chair's goal here is to just make sure that everybody is up to speed on what the Senate has done at kind of the midway point of the session in terms of bills that have moved their way across the floor of the Senate. And so this This starts out with a listing of the five tax bills that came out of this committee that have passed across the floor of the Senate and gone over to the House. Starting with Senate Bill 33, you can see that bill essentially has six provisions to it at this point in time. It has the indexing of the standard deduction amounts. It has the exemption for Social Security benefits, the exemption for retirement plan income. It has the provisions to the changes to the homestead program, the net operating loss subtraction modification provision, and the what I have labeled credit disallowance modification. That is the disallowance related to federal employment-oriented tax credits, the work opportunity tax credit, and the employee retention tax credit. And so those are the contents of Senate Bill 33. You can see the cumulative fiscal note for that bill in those 3 fiscal years there as kind of a total for that bill. The next bill is Senate Bill 169. This is the 4.75% single bracket income tax bill. You can see the fiscal note for that bill. Senate Bill 248 has 2 provisions in it. One of those is the exemption for food from the sales tax, food and food ingredients from the sales tax. You can see that the state fiscal note for that is only the first 2 years. That is because by the 3rd year under current law, that would have gone to zero anyway. And then the other provision of that is the sales tax exemption for the schools for the deaf and blind. This shows up in the table as zeros. It is actually a negative, very small number, and when rounding to the nearest tenth of a million, it's less than $50,000, and so it shows up as zero, but that is in fact negative, very small. And then you can see the total for that bill. The next bill is the Pregnancy Center Tax Credit Bill, Senate Bill 96. Finally, Senate Bill 8, which you can see the fiscal note for Senate Bill 96. And finally, Senate Bill 8, the personal property filing changes. That's kind of my 4-word summary of that bill and the various items within it. You can see that does not have an SGF fiscal note. It does have an all funds fiscal note, so to speak, because of that being a property tax bill. There's no SGF implication, but there are some approximately $400,000 of implication for the 2 state building funds and the state school district finance fund. So, and then you can see the subtotal for those fiscal impacts for all of the bills that came out of this committee that have passed across the Senate floor. The chair did ask me to include, for informational purposes, a listing of the tax implication bills that have come out of other committees that have passed across the Senate floor. These are ones that our office, of course, monitors both for general purposes. We keep track of all the bills, but also specifically for consensus revenue estimating purposes. We do try to keep track of bills that have tax fiscal notes as the statute requires us to incorporate all bills that have been enacted at the point of the revenue estimates. And so the 3 bills that the Senate has passed across its floor that had tax revenue, SGF revenue fiscal impacts that did not come out of this committee are Senate Bill 83, which came out of, I believe, the Education Committee. It's kind of a school finance and education related bills. It includes some changes to the low-income student scholarship program and its tax credit that do have an SGF impact. The next is Senate Bill 25, which I believe came out of the Senate Financial Institutions and Insurance Committee. That changes the tax rate on the insurance premiums tax for the surplus lines insurance. The third one is Senate Bill 91, which came out of the Senate Commerce Committee and includes the film incentives bill. The combined fiscal impact of that is, I believe, $12 million per year. And so then at the bottom, you can see the grand total, all bills, fiscal note that have been passed across the Senate floor as of this morning it says as of 3/8. I probably should have put 3/7 because I do think you have a tax bill on GO this afternoon, but to be clear, it's 3/8 prior to whatever action you take this afternoon. And so with that, I would happily stand for whatever questions you might have on this table.
Thank you, Eddie. And if we don't queue it up for final action, it may be tomorrow. So
Right, maybe that date won't need further clarification.
exactly. Thank you. Committee, any questions? Senator Baumgardner.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Eddie, for this chart. So could you step us through which one of these actually have wiggle room? we understand food sales tax, you've got a real track record for that. But when I look at something like the low-income student scholarship, I think right now the set is a maximum of the 10 million, and we've never up to now gotten to the 10 million. So the 3.5, the 5.5, and the 7.5 are only if we were to actually ever get to the top, and then it would be increased, correct?
I believe that those do depend upon taxpayers availing themselves of the credit. I do think there are some, if I remember correctly, and I haven't looked closely enough at this bill that I probably shouldn't try to speak to it, but I do think there are some structural changes to the tax credit itself. I think it goes from 70% to 75% in that bill. And so that change alone would have a fiscal impact, even if there is no expanded utilization of the credit.
So, but like on the film incentives and even the pregnancy center, again, that's if they were to max all of that.
Yes, those do reflect the kind of maximum possible utilization for those new proposed programs, yes.
And if I may, this is maximum on all of them, including the ones that went across the Senate floor. Last year, the legislature, what we ended up in a conference committee report was a considerably decreased amount on the Social Security exemption and the retirement. It was an equation instead of all at once. It was a gradual going to zero. Extremely gradual on the retirement since it was only $2,000 a year. But committee, any other questions? Senator Holland.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll be brief. Eddie, can I just go back to SB 248? I want to be sure I understood what crossed the Senate floor on that. I know that was the whole thing to zero, right? I mean, that was the state, that was the locals going to zero. I want to go back to the definition of the food.
It was the current definition, Senator,
Current definition of what?
of groceries.
The term used in statute is food and food ingredients. It does not include it specifically excludes within its definition prepared food. And so the definition that Senate Bill 248 uses is the same definition that current law uses.
I appreciate it, Madam Chair, because I thought those looked low, and I just want to be sure it was the same as a grocery definition.
It's the same definition, and if I may, Eddie has prepared some numbers. I don't know if we have them for today, but it's an estimate, or guesstimate, I should say, based off, you could bring those tomorrow.
But
Go ahead and give them.
It's just so, do you mean the local?
Yes.
Okay, so.
The impact to the local.
Yeah, speaking to it is probably more beneficial than the number itself because of the complexity associated with it. There have been a number of legislators who since Senate Bill 248 went across the floor have asked about the impact or potential impact or estimated impact of the food sales tax exemption upon local governments. And the reality is that it is an indeterminate impact, but we can give you some information that can be helpful in your thinking about it. So for the state impact for food sales tax, the estimated impact is that it is 15% of the statewide tax base on an aggregate statewide level. But we would note that in differing parts of the state, that impact is disparate. In places where the primary retail activity is the one grocery store in a small town, the impact is much more than 15% of the sales tax base. In places that have a large and diverse retail tax base, it's going to be smaller than 15%. So it's important to note that the 15% is the statewide aggregate level. The other thing that varies locally that does not vary state is, of course, the tax rates. There are places where there are no local sales taxes whatsoever, and there are places that have city, county, and special district sales tax rates. And so while the state rate is uniform across the state, of course, the local rates vary greatly across the state. I think they vary from 0% up to, I want to say just below 5%, maybe 4.9 or something like that is the highest aggregate local rate. And so when you look at the impact of the food sales tax exemption included in Senate Bill 248 upon the locals, the reality is that it varies greatly across the state. However, we can look at it in an aggregate level using the same sort of 15% assumption and give you an estimate of what it might be on an aggregate level. If you multiply 15% by the amount of statewide local sales taxes collected in fiscal year 2022. I believe that number comes out right around $180 million. And so that's probably a ballpark figure of what we might be looking at statewide. But it's very important to note that it's impossible to be sure of that, and that the impact will vary greatly across the state.
And I would also note that it is the first step. It does have to pass the House and the governor. And I had the opportunity to speak to the Senate president yesterday, and I know he's put out information that he is working on a solution for this, and I'm very excited about what he's doing. So any other questions for Eddie? Seeing none, thank you. Thanks, JG. Now the hard stuff, guys.
Okay.
And thank you for putting this together.
Sure.
This is good information for the committee.
The information you have in front of you is a profile. And it goes out to 2027. 2027, we have no idea what's really going to happen. Okay? We're hoping for 24. So what we're trying to do here is just kind of create a planning document for people to look at to see what the general trends are. We're not trying to project where we think the economy is going to be going, whether we're going to have a recession, whether we're going to have a huge expansion. None of that is included in here. We're taking the existing trends and just projecting them out. So that's the basic premise of what this is, and the approach that we like for people to use on this. What it is when you, just like at home, when you look at your budget, you look at how much money you have in your checking account. You add in how much money you're going to be making. You're going to put your expenditures together and come up with what you have left over. And that's what this document does. It starts off with our beginning balances, how much money in the state general fund there is available at the end of the year, beginning of the year. We bring in the estimated income for 23 and 24. Those are the consensus numbers. And then in 25, 26, and 27, those are estimated by KLRD, what we think is going to be going on in the future. And then we then reflect changes to what those estimates were. So when we look at 23, it starts off with 1.8 billion, receipts of 9.7 million. The governor made transfers of $770 million, and that consists mainly of 3 items. A transfer from the state general fund to the budget stabilization fund of $500 million, $500 million. So if you go down and look right underneath the line that says ending balance, you'll see that the budget stabilization fund had about 969 million in 22, with the addition of interest and the $500 million transfer that would push that total to $1.48 billion. Going back up then to the 770 million, there was an additional 220 million that was put into a special revenue fund, taken out of the state general fund, put into a special revenue fund for the governor in the governor's office to use for matches, local match for the infrastructure program, the federal infrastructure program. And there was $20 million set aside in a similar fashion for state agencies to use as match for that same federal program. Then we scroll down just a little bit, and you'll see that there was $321 million in reappropriations. What that is in 2022, there was an approved number for state general fund expenditures. Not all agencies spent that amount of money. some of that money rolled over that was allowed by the appropriation bill to move from 22 into 23. It was $320 million. And then if you go straight over to 24, you'll see that we take that out because it doesn't stay in the base. So it's a one-time expenditure approved without any legislative action needing. We also estimate when we do our consensus revenue, we do estimated caseloads for human services. Right now, that's showing a reduction of $198 million, and that is because the medical emergency, in that act, there was an increase of the amount of federal money that goes into Medicaid of 6.2%. So putting in the federal money, we didn't have to put in as much state funds. That shows the decrease in those state funds. And school finance, we had overestimated the number of children and in total students and as far as weighted FTE goes, so we reduced about 65 million. The governor did make some changes. Those are listed. So when we look overall, we started off with the 1.8 billion. We added the 9.7, took out the 700 to bring the total available to $10.7 billion. Our total expenditures added up, as far as the governor's recommendation goes, to $9.2 billion, leaving an ending balance of $1.5 billion. Okay. We have the budget stabilization fund included there, and then we show the percent of expenditures in the ending balance. So in 2023, according to the governor's recommendations, that would reflect a 16.5% ending balance. Statutorily, we're supposed to have at least a 7.5% ending balance. One thing that do want to note that I always look at are the receipts above or below expenditures. So when we see a negative $309 million in 23, that reflects that we are spending 300 million more than we're bringing in. So we're reducing those ending balances. We're spending part of that original savings. We do the same calculations for 2024, 25, 26, and 27. When we look at, and I'll jump around just a little bit, we have a number for 23 and 24 that we use for a base. We had an approved number for 23 expenditures, and then we set the base for 24 at $9 billion. And then there's adjustments to that. But you'll see the $9.5 billion in expenditures, the total adjusted estimated expenditures, 9,562. Since we don't know what's going to be going forward, we just use that ending balance, that ending expenditure balance, and use that as our starting point for 25. And then the same thing for 25. The only adjustments we normally put in there are for human services caseloads and school finance. So it's a bare minimum increase. Very seldom are the only two things that get adjusted, but this is the bare minimum increase going forward. And then the governor did make some recommendations going forward to put in funding for special education. So what we are reflecting in this profile are two things. One, what was not included in the original governor's recommendations was the Integra Apex agreement. So if you look at right above the total available revenue, you'll see the Integra Apex with suppliers. We did some calculations on what we believe that impact will be, and we have spread that out over the years that we're estimating here. 11.6 million in 24, 51, 52 million in 25, and then in 26 and 27, it stays up about that $85 million. I do want to note that in the Panasonic Apex approval project, we decreased the corporate income tax by 0.5% in 2024 for tax year 2024. This also reflects in the Integra program an additional reduction of 0.5% in 2025 going forward. So it would be a full 1% in 2025 going forward. Eddie went over the taxes that the Senate committee had passed out. So we do show those reductions in the total revenue reductions. If every one of those were to be passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the governor, this would be the total impact to the profile, that general planning document that we look at. It is positive for 24 and 25. If we go to 2026 with the taxes and the Apex addition that has already been approved, it does need CHIP funding from the federal government to be implemented, but we did include it in here. Then it would go negative slightly in 2026 at $370 million. Do want to note that we have $1.5 billion in the rainy day fund. I did not adjust that. So in reality, we would use $370 million from the rainy day fund to pay for this. And then when we look at 2027, with everything implemented, it would be a negative 1.1. And once again, there's the rainy day fund that's available to cover that ending balance as well. So that's the profile for the Apex with the Senate.
And just for clarification, the rainy day fund is the budget stabilization fund, just so the terminology is the same. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for putting these together, committee. And also, this does not include any tax credits or other projects like the $300 million plant in exactly.
Correct. It's been announced, but it hasn't been implemented yet.
Yeah, I just want the committee to be aware of that, where we're at. Yeah. Senator Blasey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A few questions. How long does the Apex agreement last? I mean, is it 10 years or? So the state will have something on the books for 10 years? And then,
and I think a portion of it is spread over 10 years, but I believe that in like the Panasonic, they have 5 years to make those investments. So that after the first year, they have 10 years to spend that one. So technically, it'd probably be closer to 15.
I would ask if the suppliers are also an extension of that when they start. Is that?
I didn't grab my notebook.
Senator Blasey.
and on school finance, if I'm reading this correctly, there's a massive increase for fiscal year 2025. Is this the CPI catching up with inflation?
Correct. There's two things there. One is the CPI catching up the inflation, and what the senator's talking about is school finance is for 25 and out years is based off of a 3-year average of the Midwest CPIU. So we have a 5-6% increase in funding for the base going forward in 24, 25, and then going out as well.
Thank you.
The other thing is the governor there was a sunset on the high density at risk weighting. And the governor added the funding back in, so that's why it's 240 instead of about $170 million.
But we were gonna, and we can ask for that committee, we were gonna do a run based off of where the current Senate budget was. And if we do want to do that, it might be a little premature, and I know these guys are busy. Senator Baumgardner.
I just think it's important to note, you see that K through 12 special education, the 92%. What the governor built in was that all of that would be shouldered by the taxpayers of Kansas, as opposed to the 40% that is in federal law that the federal government is to provide, which they have never provided since they passed that law. So it is interesting that what's built in here is it would be shouldered by Kansans as opposed to the federal government. And what we did learn in the hearings on the Senate Education is other states are actually getting more than what we're getting from the feds. Thank you, Mr. Chair, or Madam Chair and JG.
No, that's an excellent point. So JG, would you mind putting together a run that excluded that number for this committee?
Sure, and just kind of tie on, the federal money that is not being added into special education more than covers the entire shortfall that the state is trying to make up over 5 years.
Senator Holland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question and then a run request. Just so I understand, is the Panasonic Apex expenditures, where are those reflected in?
That's reflected in the consensus number, in the revenues at top. So when we did the consensus numbers, we had those Apex numbers already, and those are baked into those consensus revenue estimates at the very top.
Okay. And then if appropriate, Madam Chair, I just wanted to ask a slight revision of the run. Could you basically give me what you've got here, that if you strike the retirement income policy piece in Senate Bill 33 and strike Senate Bill 169 in its entirety, could you give me a run on what that looks like?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Committee, any other questions? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. A couple quick questions on the governor's rec. We have the local ad valorem tax reduction fund that we haven't funded for years, but it is in statute. Is that included in the governor's recommendation for 20?
No, if you look in 2025, very good question. I should have pointed this out. In 2025, there is an addition of $169 million in the governor's revenue transfer line. That is to not pay those transfers. And then in 26 and 27, you'll see the 230 and 234 million. That's once again what is not being transferred. Those transfers were baked in the consensus estimate at the top because it was on current law, and then we're showing those adjustments to that total. So you'll see that that those are not included in these estimates. So those are not being transferred.
Yeah, and the reason the request was made that way is we haven't paid those transfers in 20 years.
23.
Oh, 23 years.
2003.
2003. Okay, 20 years. Okay.
20 years.
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I should know the answer to this question. The Budget Stabilization Fund, is that an automatic if there's a shortfall, or is that take legislative action, a simple majority?
That takes a simple majority. It's a statute, so it can be adjusted with any legislation. So it can be spent any time that the legislature and the governor approve those type of expenditures.
Senator Corson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Quick question about the Budget Stabilization Fund balance. So that keeps increasing. And then can you just show me where the transfers to that fund are reflected on here? Is that under governor's revenue transfers?
Correct.
Okay, so we're projecting, even in years where we are spending more than we're taking in, we're still projecting that we're going to be adding to the budget stabilization fund?
Very good question. There's language in the budget stabilization fund that says it gets to keep the interest that it earns. So the increases that you see is closer to, $12, $15 million in interest that we would anticipate that the budget stabilization fund would be earning and be able to keep that interest. So that's why it's going up $10 or $12 million. There's no statutory authority for anything be deposited into this fund without legislative action. So there's no automatic transfers for anything unless it's in an appropriation bill.
But are you projecting that? Is that what the 245.3 in estimated 2026 and the 250.2 in FY 2027 are? Or is that a different thing under the governor's revenue transfers in 26 and 27?
Oh, thank you. The only transfer that's actually included in here is in 2023, and that's $500 million. That's $500 million. The rest of those transfers are other transfers that are happening in the governor's budget. There's only the one transfer for the budget stabilization fund of $500 million in 23.
And then everything else is just the addition of the interest. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Committee, any other questions? Senator Reddy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was wondering, I don't know if you're the correct person to ask, for the Apex deal as well as the Integra, were there any clawbacks involved in those things where if they don't meet certain things or certain funds or anything of that sort?
Thank you, Senator. Eddie, would you mind?
Thank you.
Yeah, while I can't speak to the agreement-specific clawbacks, the statute itself does have certain clawback provisions if the entities receiving Apex leave the state within a certain time period.
Thank you. But if the company goes bankrupt, there's no bonding or clawbacks, or is there bonding available?
I don't believe the statute requires a bond to be posted as it relates to those clawbacks, and so it would be dependent upon it being in the agreement itself, which I doubt, but I can't say with certainty. We can make an inquiry of commerce as to that information.
Okay, thank you. Committee, any other questions?
Okay, and then just very quickly, the other.
Yeah, because I'd like to work a couple bills real quick.
Okay, the other profile you have is the exact same thing, only it includes the Apex 3, which is something that's been talked about. We didn't know what those numbers are, so we took an average of Integra and Panasonic and put it in. So that would be the impact with that included as well, same as the other profile as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much, JG. Committee, I'm going to turn your attention to Senate Bill 127. Amelia, will you give us an overview? I'll make it worth Senator Clay's time.
Madam Chair, Senate Bill number 127 would authorize Dickinson County to submit to its electors the question of imposing a countywide retailer sales tax at the rate of 0.25%, and pledging such revenue for purposes of financing the costs of public safety capital projects.
Committee, any questions? What are your wishes on the bill? Senator Clay? Oh, Senator Holland.
Would move that we pass out SB 127 favorable.
It's been moved by Senator Holland, seconded by Senator Glaze. I was going to let him have the honor. I thought you were going to ask a question. Okay, it's been moved by Senator Holland, seconded by Senator Glaze. Discussion on the motion. Senator Baumgardner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Always want the opportunity for the locals to be able to vote. It is very troubling with all of the money that came into this state during COVID, when actually, what was shared with us was that inability to be working within the county and with neighboring counties, particularly with emergency medical services. So that at no point in time were they using any of that federal money coming in. I just find that egregious.
That is a great question, Senator, and I'm afraid that is what we've seen, especially if you look at the legislative post-audit with where spending went. A lot of it was not for emergency or infrastructure, where it most of us would think that it would need to be. But any other discussion on the bill? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion pass. Would you like to be recorded? No. Okay. Motion carries. Committee, I know many of you are receiving questions about appraisals that came out this last week, and we will be doing an informational hearing, hopefully next week on that. I have quite a bit of information for you on it, but let your constituents know that they still have a chance to hold their taxes down because of Senate Bill 13, the revenue neutral rate hearings they can attend. And we will be, this committee will be working on that letter next week on updating it. We do have a little bit of time. I wanted to work 29. We'll come back to it. We've tried it a few times. Let's turn our attention to Senate Bill 147. We may not finish it, but we can at least start it this morning. Amelia, would you mind giving us an overview?
Senate Bill number 147 relates to income tax and would increase the amount of the tax credit for adoption expenses and make the credit refundable.
Committee, any questions? Senator Blasey.
No questions, but if there isn't any other questions, I'll move
I
that.
think there might be an amendment
Okay.
on it.
Go ahead.
Okay. Committee, discussion, amendments? Or would you like to hold this for another day?
I can make a motion and see what the committee wishes.
I think we've got to pause. Why don't we pick this up tomorrow? Hopefully we'll have time tomorrow. If there are any amendments, please bring them because I would like to pass this out sooner than later. I would also like to work Senate Bill 164, committee, 58, 29, as time permits. Committee, is there any other business to be brought before the committee? Seeing none, we're adjourned. Thank you.